Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Dorothy O'Byrne here from the CCMA. Absolutely delighted to see so many of you joining our webinar this afternoon. We normally give a couple of minutes just for people to get logged in and make sure they're all set up and that they can see and hear us. So again, we could ask as normal to give us an indication if you have any issues, if you can't hear or see us, just give us a little note in the chat section over to the right-hand side of your screen. And while you're doing that, I'm going to formally introduce our speakers. So there's a huge amount of interest in this topic today, which is great to see. And the title, as you all know, is Employer Obligations, Considering Tax, Legal and Wellbeing Obligations in a Remote Working Environment. So we know it's a topic that you've all been struggling with and working with for the last 9 months, and we've certainly covered a lot of aspects in terms of coaching, leading, well-being, but I think this is the first time we've talked about the tax legal aspect as well. And obviously we're delighted to be joined by a number of experts in this area who are delighted to be here and will be very willing to answer any questions that you have. So just to introduce them first, and then I'll hand over to Nuala, who'll be our first speaker. So Nuala Clayton, who's the Partner of Employment and Benefits at William Fry, and she's going to talk about health and safety considerations and the obligations in terms of remote working. Then Catherine O'Flynn, who's the Partner and Head of Employment and Benefits at William Fry, will talk about employment law obligations of remote working, including time recording, risks of working in a foreign country and stress claims. Then to be followed by Daryl Hanbury, Partner Tax and Technology, Media and Telecommunications at Deloitte, who will give an overview of the tax and compliance considerations when employees work from home in foreign jurisdiction, which I know is a topic I've received several queries on. And then last but by no means least, Orla Stafford, who's the Human Capital Senior Manager at Deloitte. And Orla is going to give us a perspective on a new approach to work and leadership and managing the engagement and well-being of remote teams, which we know is a big concern to employers and a big challenge that we've all been facing in the last number of months. So as always, we will be taking questions. You again will be familiar with the little panel over to the right-hand side of your screen. So please put through any questions that you have. I know we already have a couple in advance of today's webinar, but certainly the objective is to answer as many as we can. Each of the panelists is going to speak for about 10 minutes. And then we have plenty of time at the end for questions. So please do feel free to send them through and I'll put them to the panel. So I'm going to hand over now to you, Nuala, if that's okay. And the rest of us are going to go off screen. And thanks a lot, Nuala. Put it in your capable hands. Thank you.
Thanks, Dorothy. And thanks a million for the invitation to join you today. And we're delighted to be here. I suppose just to kick off the session, what I'm going to focus on is health and safety considerations as they relate to working from home. And, you know, for many attendees today, there will be a variety of responses if we were to step back and ask ourselves to what degree our own organisations have addressed health and safety considerations in relation to our workforce being at home. So back in March, April time, the Health and Safety Authority, as the applicable regulator for workplace health and safety, addressed working from home in a more limited way and published limited guidance. But I suppose at that time, bear in mind, we weren't sure how long we'd be in this situation. But in recent weeks, the HSA has moved to publish a more detailed document, and it's called the Guidance on Working from Home for Employers and Employees. And it's available on the HSA's website. And I encourage all attendees to have a look at it because it's a helpful guidance document in this context. So the document broadly states that it is recognised that working from home, of course, has many benefits. But working from home effectively requires management and it requires coordination to ensure that employees aren't put at risk in the longer term in terms of health and safety hazards while working from home. And one thing that the document states very clearly, and I think it's worth bearing in mind at the outset of the presentation, is that the responsibility for health and safety at work rests with the employer. And it's whether or not the work is being done by an employee at home or in the workplace. And I would say that there's nothing new about that definition because the legislation, which is a 2005 Act, so it's quite old, it clearly states that the place of work can really, it's broadly defined to such an extent that it can really cover anywhere, including someone's home. But bear in mind that we're in a different zone, we're in a different sphere. And while a lot of organisations may have supported home working and had some staff working from home historically, that has certainly changed during 2020. So while it's not a new definition or a new concept, the responsibilities for an employer as they relate to an employee's home have certainly increased and should be looked at more closely for that reason. So broadly speaking, employers need to think about how they consult with their employees in relation to health and safety at work if the workplace is home. And employers are required to assess the workplace and to think about the work activities being done in that workplace, because bear in mind, again, for all attendees, we don't all do the same things and our work activities vary depending on our organisation and what we do day to day. Obviously, employers have to consider, and I hope by this stage will have provided employees at home with suitable work equipment to support them in working safely in their own home. And importantly, and it's something that will be touched on later on today's webinar, contact arrangements are probably a more net point that might not necessarily spring to your mind when you think about health and safety in the workplace when the workplace is a home. But contact and maintaining contact with employees is definitely a health and safety consideration to be considered in that regard. And all of those sort of broad principles are underpinned by the fact that, again, in the primary legislation, and this is nothing new, an employer has various obligations. They have to provide safe systems of work to their employees. They have to provide safe means of doing that work, safe equipment. Employers are required to assess the risks in a workplace and to seek to put in place control measures to minimize or eradicate those risks. And they have to provide training to employees to help them carry out their roles safely and effectively. And again, those aren't new concepts, but we're looking at them and we're reframing them in relation to COVID-19 and being at home in 2020. The document does acknowledge, and I think it's very helpful, it acknowledges that employees also have a key role to play in this regard. And I suppose stepping back from it, employees aren't right in front of you in the workplace. They're not present or physically there so you can engage with them. We're doing it in a different way. But again, that's already in statute. Employees have to cooperate with their employers in relation to matters of health and safety. They have to follow instructions, they have to participate in training, they have to tell you if any issues are taking place or have taken place, or importantly, they'd have to tell you if they injured themselves in the workplace. And we can apply that both when we're in the office and not in the office. And a key thing to remember is that employees are statutorily obliged to do everything they can to protect themselves in terms of their own health and safety at work. So the guidance document that the HSA has prepared says that a good way to deal with all of this is to capture all those principles in a working from home policy. And I think certainly that's something that in our practice we would see employers having taken steps to prepare over recent months, because once you have a document, it means everyone is on all fours about what is required and what's expected. And it's very clear to employees what will happen and how these things will be considered and assessed. So the policy is going to also cover obligations on both sides, and it's going to deal with how an employer proposes that risk when working from home will be assessed. And so the HSA, following from that, has provided some helpful guidance about how an employer should carry out risk assessments when employees are working from home. I think, again, stepping back, we need to acknowledge that everyone's home working environment is different. So when you look at the various speaker screens today, you're going to see that we're all in very different setups. No one home is the same. Not everyone lives in a space where they have a dedicated working area, but we're doing the best that we can in the current scenario. So I think you have to approach it in that regard, and bear in mind that everything is not consistent or standard across the board as it would be if you were in an office environment. So an employer has to risk assess the workstation or the workplace that an employee is using in his or her own home. And the purpose of that risk assessment is to consider and assess whether any risks have arisen and to address those issues and concerns and to try and put in place effective control measures to minimize or eradicate those risks. The HSA has helpfully given employers a template document. So for many organisations and for many attendees today, you might be thinking, well, our normal risk assessment procedures in the office would be looking at risks around maybe our kitchen areas, our canteen facilities, our gyms, if you're lucky enough to have one, our photocopying rooms and things like that, logical areas that need to be assessed in terms of risk in the office. And so it's to be welcomed that the HSA has said, well, here are the kind of things that employers need to look at when they're risk assessing home working environments. So the HSA proposes that employers address this via 2 steps. The first step is to send the template checklist or a template checklist prepared by the employer to employees and to consult with the employees in relation to the equipment that they need in order to carry out their role when working from home effectively. And once that has been done, the employer can move to step 2. And step 2 states that an employer should engage a competent person to carry out the risk assessment in conjunction with the employee. So just to pause there for a moment to consider the wording competent person. So the guidance states that a competent person is someone with sufficient training, experience and knowledge to carry out the risk assessment. And I know during 2020, I think a school of thought or an approach may have developed in certain organisations that if an online ergonomic assessment was provided to an employee at home and he or she filled it out and returned it to the employer, that would be sufficient in terms of assessing home risk. In my view, given the guidance that has now come from the HSA and the fact that there's a focus on a competent person, that won't be sufficient. And employers would be best placed to involve a competent person to ensure the risk assessments are being done correctly and to minimise risk. Because bear in mind that an individual can't be expected to have the requisite knowledge or skill set to consider health and safety risks in their own home environment, or to try and understand or decide how they could minimise those risks. So certainly it's proposed to be a collaborative approach. The HSA says that the best way of doing this is to have a video call, and ideally it would be done on a mobile. And the reason for that is that an employee could move around their workspace so that the competent person could assess the risk and take a look at the area and see how it's been set up and record any issues that are noted between the two parties and agree on corrective actions that will be taken between the employer and the employee. And once all those things have been actioned and remedied, the risk assessment can be ticked, completed and signed off as everything has been actioned. So the sorts of risks that the HSA suggests should be considered in this context are things like sufficient lighting in the workspace at home, housekeeping matters such as, for example, someone may have a huge pile of documents or papers sitting right beside their feet, and obviously if they get up quickly they might trip over them. So something as basic as a housekeeping check to ensure there's nothing sitting like that that might cause an unnecessary risk. Temperature in the workplace equally applies to temperature at home. Electrical safety is obviously a very relevant one. Again, if someone has 14 cables plugged into one socket board, they're creating an unnecessary risk that the employer should seek to minimise and control. Fire safety is something that the HSA suggests has to be considered. And then going back to basics, ergonomics, so display screen equipment, chairs, desks, keyboards, things like that, and how people are actually set up and working at home. So I suppose I would say in concluding, this is really helpful and useful for employers. On one hand, you know, when a regulator issues guidance, sometimes people have a bit of a fright, but I suppose it's good to know what the HSA is looking for. And they're making it clear that as this situation develops and continues, we're not in our typical working scenario. And while this was something that was temporary, it's clearly going to continue. The government has republished an updated return to work safely protocol in the last number of days. And it emphasises again the fact that working from home should be continuing where possible. And in that regard, employers need to think about what they've done to date in the health and safety front and what they should be doing. So I think it's just thinking about health and safety and risk assessing workplaces from a different angle. We're not in the normal working scenario. So certainly having the guidance there is really helpful and really important for employers. And I would encourage attendees to take a read of the guidance and seek advice as required. So
Nuala, before we move on, I have two questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course, Dorothy, go for it.
Great. So the first one from Anna, if you were to assess an employee's working from home space and, for example, determine the employee needs a better chair, if the employee opts to not take the chair for whatever reason, where do you go from there? Should the employee sign some kind of waiver saying it was recommended but they declined it?
Yeah, so I think it's something that for whatever reason, I don't know why someone would be declining, probably a more appropriate, I assume, chair from their employer. But certainly once you've documented that you've tried to intervene and to collaborate with the employee in that regard, I think documenting that exchange will help you in showing you tried to meet your obligations there and best efforts were being made. I think that's a good plan.
Great. And then the second question from Chris is, what are the obligations, if any, for furloughed staff that are still paid by the company and part of the WSS?
I'm not sure if we're talking about furloughed staff in relation to health and safety at home. I suppose where they're not working, I don't see that health and safety obligations arise if someone is not working. But if someone is working but under the employer wage subsidy scheme, then that really only relates to how the person is being paid. So the same obligations would arise if they're working at home in terms of health and safety.
Okay, I have a couple of more questions. If it's okay, I'll shoot them to you now. I think it's probably appropriate. Sure. How can an organisation with a large number of employees realistically have one-to-one interaction between an employee and a competent person? Is it enough for a competent person to review an employee's online assessment results and interact with the employee if necessary? And that question's from Brian.
Hi, Brian. I think it's a fair question because obviously, looking at the HSA guidance, it's worded in such a way that the expectation is one-on-one, and I'm not sure that necessarily that reflects, every organisation at every size. I suppose in terms of having done online assessments, you'd have to think about the sufficiency of how they were done. So do they cover the things that the HSA is looking for? And then, as you say, engage with the employee, if that is in an online sense, with intervention from a competent person. While it mightn't be absolutely perfect, it will certainly get you there in terms of showing that you are, again, making best efforts in this strange scenario we find ourselves in.
Okay, and sorry, one other question, and there's a couple more, but I think we can come back to them at the panel discussion. So Laura said, heating, clean floor, etc., their home setup and functionalities, how would an employer be liable to change heating in a home?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, employers are obliged under health and safety law to ensure the adequacy of temperature in an office. And so when you look again at the definition of place of work, it covers a home. It's one thing the HSA has asked employers to work on and to look at. And yeah, it's to collaborate and to cooperate with your employee in confirming that with them in terms of risk. So it is something you have to consider.
And sorry, one last quick question. I'm conscious of time, from John. What obligations do we have to a home work location in another country?
I think, I suppose as remote working continues, we're all aware, and certainly it's something we'll look at and is going to be discussed in the webinar, people are not necessarily in their local jurisdiction. Insofar as employees are working in other jurisdictions, it would be pragmatic to take local advice in relation to health and safety obligations in that jurisdiction.
Great. And I know there's a good few more questions there, but I'll bring them back to the panel discussion if that's okay with everybody that sent them through. Thanks, Nuala.
That's fine. So Dorothy, I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Catherine O'Flynn, who's going to talk about some employment law considerations that arise in relation to remote working. And I think, Catherine, you're starting with a poll question.
Thanks, Nuala. And hello to everybody. It's great to see so many people have joined us today. Yes, I think we are going to have a poll question. Niamh, I don't know if you can get that poll question up for everybody at the moment. Yeah, great. Brilliant. Thank you, Niamh. So this is really just to kind of gauge the feeling amongst the audience in terms of the future. So would your preference be to remain working remotely, either at home or in a hub, I guess, for the future? Or are you absolutely dying to get back to your office as quickly as you can? Or would your preference be to have a blended working arrangement? So a mixture of, say, 2 days in the office and the balance at home or in a hub. So if you could give us your preferences there, that would be great. I know my preference certainly would be to have the blended working arrangement, which if we look at any recent surveys that have been carried out, seems to be the preference amongst the majority. So it'll be great to see what our preference is here today. I'll just carry on. Sorry, Niamh, go ahead.
We might just give that another 10 seconds and I'll close it out.
Sure, no problem. Yeah, no rush. As Nuala said, most of us working remotely at the moment anyway, given the current restrictions in all very different setups. As you can see, I have had a lot of quips over the last few months as to whether I am in Claire Byrne's home office or working from a sauna. So I've had a good few of those comments. Here we go. So yeah, I think that's very reflective of society as a whole. The vast majority are hoping to have a blended working arrangement in the future. So that's great to know. So thank you everybody for letting us know. So I think all the more topical then to be talking about remote working, given that we've really moved away from an emergency reaction to the pandemic, and really it's becoming a way of life. And one of the big issues, of course, for employers has been covered off by Nuala, which is the health and safety issues involving working from home. So I'm going to take us through some of the main employment law issues. So what I would say is that really from an employment law perspective, employers can take it that all of the obligations remain the same as if your employee was at work in the old-fashioned standard physical office. Certainly there are some practical difficulties with that we have seen and we've been advising on. So the kind of things that we've been advising on would be how to deal with performance issues, how to manage those remotely, how to carry out an investigation remotely, how to hold a disciplinary hearing remotely, and unfortunately in many circumstances how to carry out a redundancy consultation remotely. And what I would say is that over time employers and employees are both becoming more familiar with these concepts and familiar with dealing with these things on a remote basis, and by and large they are working well. We've also been dealing with requests for flexible working, so where people have demands on them at home, whether that be looking after young children, or indeed caring for relatives who may have been sick. So how to respond to a request for flexible working or to change hours or to vary contracts. We've also then been assisting employers in terms of managing remote teams, which can be extremely tricky if you've never dealt with a remote team before. As Nuala pointed out too, when we're not seeing people day to day, you can miss the kind of physical signs that someone perhaps is suffering mentally, perhaps because of the isolation. So that's a big topic for discussion and something that Orla will be looking at in more detail today, which is great because it is of vital importance to employers. One issue that I did want to touch on today is keeping of records. So that's keeping records of working hours and rest breaks taken by employees. So when we've been talking to clients over the last few months, it actually came as a bit of a surprise to some employers that there is this legal obligation to keep records of hours worked per week, and also to keep records of rest breaks that are taken. And this is under the Organisation of Working Time Act, which is from 1997. So this has created some practical difficulties. And I guess this legislation was enacted at a time when we were mainly working 9 to 5 in standard offices. Obviously, the world has changed and we are now working remotely and we are working flexibly. And so this rigid requirement to keep these records, as I said, has come as a bit of a surprise to some clients. And some, aren't very comfortable with going out to their employees who are now working remotely and asking them to keep and maintain records. Some of my clients said to me, it's been such a period of change and turmoil, and our employees are working so well from home that an employer didn't really want to take any steps that might suggest they didn't trust those employees. And so they have taken on the risk of not complying with this legislation. But unfortunately, the legal obligation does exist. And there are fines that could be imposed if the employer does not comply with them of up to €2,500. But also if an employee was to bring a claim to say that they have been working excessive hours or their employer has not allowed them to take their breaks, in the absence of those records, it will be very difficult, if not impossible really, to defend such a claim. And an employee can be awarded up to 2 years remuneration with those types of claims. So as I said, although with this COVID world of remote work, it is a very complex task, we should remember that it is currently a legal requirement. Now, helpfully, the government has committed to looking at this piece of legislation, the Organisation of Working Time Act, and has committed to looking to see if there are any deficiencies in it. And this has come about in terms of discussions about the right to disconnect, which I'll come on to again in a moment. So that's good, but for the moment, it is still a legal obligation. Another area of employment law and also really technology law that I wanted to touch upon is that of data protection and privacy. So where we have employees working from home, this really should be at the front of our minds as well. We've had clients who have employees working from home who are actually sharing spaces with competitors. So we've had to make sure that the client's policies when it comes to privacy and confidentiality are very well communicated, and if needs be, refreshed and updated. We've also had instances where confidential information is not being stored carefully enough, or indeed not being disposed of carefully enough. We really don't want documents going out into the green bin on a Sunday night, that's for sure. So in terms of action points there, I think it's really important to check your transparency notices, check your data protection policies. As I said, make sure that they are fit for purpose and have been communicated to all your employees. Check your monitoring policies. Are you acting in compliance with those? And really just protect your IT system, given the pressures that are being put on our IT systems at the moment. And I guess with Black Friday and Cyber Monday around the corner, now is as good a time as any to look at those kind of things. As has already been highlighted this morning, when we talk about working from home, we tend to think about employees working from home in Ireland, but of course that hasn't been the case. A lot of employees have located back to their home country, or perhaps that of their spouse. So if you have data being transferred outside of the EEA as part of that, then it would be very worthwhile to carry out a data mapping exercise to see if that is happening, and if it is happening, to make sure that you have the sufficient safeguards in place. So as I said, some employees have relocated back to their home country, or that of a spouse or their parents. And we have all seen the media reports, I imagine, of the technology companies who have started to call those employees back to Ireland. And what I would say is that is primarily driven by tax considerations, which Daryl is going to bring us through helpfully. But there are some employment obligations, or implications, I should say, to think about if you have employees in different jurisdictions from the one in which they are employed. And that is because the Rome Convention means that employees in member states, in EU member states, can enjoy the mandatory employment laws of the countries in which they are situated, if they are more beneficial to them. So if, broadly speaking, Irish employment law is favourable to employees, but you could have an employee who has relocated to Paris, for example, and France would have better collective rights than Ireland would have. Or you could have an employee in a country that has perhaps better sick pay entitlements or better pension entitlements. And if they are better than the Irish provisions, you may have a situation where an employee may look to avail of those. If it is only a temporary arrangement, and it's quite clear from both sides that it is temporary and the employee is due to come back to Ireland any day, then the risk is relatively low. But if this arrangement is becoming more permanent, then we would definitely advise you seek local law advice to make sure that you're not caught out by any local employment laws. And I guess particularly if you are considering taking any steps to terminate employment or implement redundancies, all the more so important to make sure you don't get caught out there by any local law obligations. Also, for any regulated entities that are joining us here today, I'm sure you're aware that the regulator may require certain roles within a regulated entity be carried out in Ireland. So do be mindful of that as well. And then when it comes to any requests to those employees to return to Ireland, if you feel you need to, then from an employment perspective, check the contract, see what it says about place of work, and then enter into those discussions in a reasonable manner, giving notice to your employees and also in line with any public health guidance as well. In terms of developments then in this whole area of remote working, I'm pleased to say that there is a lot of discussion at government level on the whole topic of remote working. And as Leo Varadkar said in a speech last week, developments that might have taken about 10 to 15 years to take place really are coming about overnight, given the situation that we all found ourselves in with COVID and this unprecedented instance of mass home working. So it was something that was on the government's agenda in 2019, and I guess in light of the EU directive on work-life balance. But certainly COVID coming along changed things and really shone a new light on this whole topic. So in July 2020, the government opened a public consultation on this topic and called for submissions, and over 550 submissions were received by the government on this topic. They recently published a review of the submissions. So the kind of things that were being discussed or talked about were training, that we've touched on, for managers. How do you assess performance? How do you monitor that kind of thing? Also, of course, the environmental impact of remote working. Also data protection issues, which we've touched on. And there are a couple of draft bills actually that are being debated, a private member bill and a Labour bill, which look at the right to disconnect. So that's all about trying to combat this always on mentality that unfortunately a lot of employees are suffering from. But what Leo Varadkar has said is that we have to take a very flexible approach to that, because obviously working flexibly suits a lot of employees who perhaps like to log in very early if they are managing employees in different jurisdictions, or like to work late in the evening after children have gone to bed. So it's a very important topic, but one that we need to look at very carefully. And the government has committed to publishing a strategy on remote work before the end of the year, which will touch on all of these topics. It will look at the right to disconnect. It will look at whether employees should be allowed to require, or sorry, should be allowed to ask to work from home, which currently they don't have a right to do. And it will also look at what tax and expense arrangements need to be brought into line and updated in light of this new way of working. In relation to tax, actually, the next speaker is going to be Daryl, who will take us through the various tax issues, particularly in relation to employees who have relocated to countries outside of their home country.
Catherine, before you hand over, I might just put this question for both of you from Lizzie. She addressed it to you. Hi, Catherine. Is it an all-in approach to local law, as in, can you only choose one Irish employment law or local employment law, not a mix?
Well, it'll be a mix, because you may have employees who were employed in Ireland and they're on a contract that says Irish law will apply. So then they move to a different jurisdiction to see out the pandemic, or it becomes more permanent and they might be working from France, to use that example again. So the Rome Convention will allow them to have the benefit of any mandatory employment laws that are more beneficial to them than the ones that are provided for under Irish employment law or under their contract. So employees will actually be able to enjoy both. And that's without the employer taking any steps or amending the contract. So that's why it's very important if you are the employer to get ahead of that, to see what the local laws are, to make sure that you're in compliance with both, and to kind of tidy the house in that respect.
Great, thanks, Catherine.
Thanks,
okay,
Catherine.
so I'll pass over to Daryl. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Sorry, I was laughing at your enjoying both laws, Catherine. I think when it comes to tax, I'm not sure anyone uses the description to enjoy both jurisdictions, but the law of both jurisdictions will apply. Thanks very much, Catherine. We might just move on briefly just to the next slide. So as part of today's discussion, I'm just going to talk briefly around the international remote working. So what typically happens if you're like most employers that we've had conversations and interacted with, is that in March, you know, it was everyone needed to work from home. Well-being, people's you know, health was paramount. People looking to where they were going to work from home, and employers, you know, one had more important things to be thinking about at the time, and probably didn't have the time to consider, well, what does working from home mean? So for the majority of people, it does mean working from your house in some part of Ireland if you're normally employed in Ireland. But for a significant minority, that has proven to be actually working from another jurisdiction, and that creates a whole host of considerations and implications that companies need to be aware of. It's not that someone can't work for internationally, but when that happens, an organization needs to carefully consider all of the implications in that regard. When we did a couple of surveys, probably early on in the COVID work from home scenarios, actually we found quite favorable responses from workers, very similar to what we saw in some of the earlier polls that we took, where actually people thought they were more productive at home, and they think they can do their job efficiently in a home environment. And what was interesting from an employee perspective, we got very similar feedback even very early on, that there was a small portion, maybe that was 10 to 20%, who you know, actually I never want to go back to the office again, and there was 10 to 20% who, you know, actually get me back to the office, I cannot, you know, abide being at home. And then in the middle, there was that 60% who said, well, maybe some sort of blended. I think as people have realized as well that remote working in April, particularly if you had young children, was not normal remote working. Your shops were closed, you couldn't go to get lunch wherever, you're probably were trying to manage childcare. And actually towards the end of the summer, that probably expanded when people said, actually remote working, particularly as the kids went back to school, this is a bit more enjoyable, I can be productive. What is interesting is that organizations, I think from that remote working perspective, have also really engaged with this. This is a positive on both sides, and that CFOs, you know, are definitely now planning to have people work remotely, and all the implications that come with that. So just moving on to the next piece, in terms of some of the tax implications. Maybe if you could go on a slide. Thank you. You know, obviously there's a wide variety of tax implications, and you know, while I'm sure many of you would enjoy a deep dive for 2 hours into the tax implications, I've been asked to kind of summarize this in a couple of minutes. The most obvious thing that people think about is around the personal tax compliance, and that's the employer obligations within that regard. Your typical scenario would be you were told to go work from home, you're normally based in Dublin, and now you're working out of Berlin, and enjoying the German culture while actually still working for the Irish entity. What is typically seen as a myth, but seems to be accepted, is that people equate residence and tax residency with 6 months of the year or 183 days. And that, for payroll purposes, is simply not the case. So companies need to be aware that actually those payroll obligations kick in many jurisdictions a lot sooner than that. So for example, if people were coming into Ireland from working abroad, those foreign organizations could have implications within 30 days of working in Ireland. And clearly we're long past 30 days for those of remote working. You know, what also is of interest is that people will believe that there are concessions, that governments will not chase people around payroll obligations. And indeed, in some countries, and not all, but some countries did issue concessions around payroll operation for the period of COVID. I think when that was initially released, or those concessions were given, COVID was seen to be, this will be done by the end of the summer, 3 months there, let's move on. I'm not sure it was foreseen that COVID will certainly now extend into 2021. So I think companies just need to be careful from that perspective. Linking back to, for example, another implication to something that Catherine mentioned around remote redundancies, for example, people working in another jurisdiction can have significant implications on whatever redundancy payment is made. And then the other topic that comes up frequently around individuals is around expenses for remote working. So again, if you're working in a remote jurisdiction, what might work for Irish tax might not work in that other jurisdiction, and might be subject to tax in that jurisdiction. So it's a whole coterie of things there just to consider. Keeping in theme with the personal side, there's also immigration and immigration issues that companies need to deal with. So many companies who employ individuals in Ireland, you know, employ them under an immigration permit of some description, and a lot of those permits, or most of those permits, require those individuals to work in the state. So obviously, you know, I think the Irish government will bring a sensible approach as they address this going forward. But clearly there's an issue there for companies just to consider, well, what is the position? What's of more concern and more immediate concern is if an individual, for example, is now, instead of working in Dublin, working in India, do they have work permission to work in India? the common misconception is that, well, if someone's gone to a foreign jurisdiction, they're gone to their home jurisdiction, and that should be fine. That might be okay, and might be the case. But we've seen, for example, where a lot of individuals have gone to the home location of their spouse. So they're, you know, their spouse may be from India, but they're not. So therefore, you have to consider whether that's the case. And then we've also seen, and I think there were a couple of articles in the newspapers recently about it, where individuals just went, why would I work from Dublin and the rain when I can go and sit in the south of France or in mid-Italy and soak up the environment there? I've no obligations. I can work from anywhere. And people have just gone and done that. And so obviously the EU is fine, but if you go beyond that, you may have to consider some of the immigration issues. On some of the other tax pieces, the other main piece that people will consider is around creating a corporate tax presence in another jurisdiction. And again, while there are some jurisdictions have provided concessions to that, regard, it isn't really clear cut, and it depends on the number of employees that you would have in that jurisdiction. So there is no one size fits all. But again, if you create a corporate tax presence in another foreign jurisdiction, you're creating obviously tax leakage and potential corporate tax obligations. But in an Irish context, that is hugely critical, because corporate tax and the corporate tax structuring is a huge part of a lot of organizations' structures whenever they're in Ireland. So it's bringing the two things, that talent and tax together. The risk around that really hinges on who is working in those foreign jurisdictions. So are there senior individuals? And we've had cases where the CEO might be in that foreign jurisdiction, and the impact that has. Because then whenever, excuse me, whenever you move from the permanent establishment and you have a permanent establishment for corporate tax purposes, you need to consider the transfer pricing and the transfer pricing impacts. And that really, revolves around, well, how much are you going to remunerate that foreign entity or permanent establishment? And clearly, if you have, a scenario where you are, generating the bulk of your profits as a result of technology, if the key activities related to that technology are undertaken in Ireland, then the bulk of the revenues are attributed to Ireland. We see that, reported on a regular basis. However, if as a result of COVID-19, the team undertaking that technology development is no longer in Ireland, then this will be more difficult to sustain and creates a risk in that foreign jurisdiction. Other aspects, just briefly to mention, will be around research and development tax credits. Ireland is a very favourable jurisdiction in which to carry out R&D. If that individual is now carrying out those activities in Germany, for example, they may be fine. But actually, if there's a permanent establishment created, that actually may cause issues for the Irish R&D tax credit. And if, for example, they've relocated to India to carry on that R&D spend will not qualify for the Irish R&D tax credit. So that has greater implications than just the general tax. Again, I think Catherine mentioned a lot about the data tracking, and this flows through to the tax because I think that will help support it. Other minor issues or other issues that may be relevant, again, around the VAT, and that is a lower bar around a permanent establishment. So you could create a fixed establishment there that creates obligations in that jurisdiction. So just what can companies do? Just moving on to the next slide. One of the key things, and one of the things I remember from my time when I was living in the US, the news talks about it's 10 p.m. Do you know where your kids are? Now, I think where you apply this in this scenario, it's coming close to the end of 2020. It's the 31st of December 2020. Do you know where your employees are? And honestly, most companies will probably say we know where a good chunk of our employees are, but are there those who potentially slip through the cracks? Absolutely. And I think from an organization perspective, you need to acknowledge that the issue exists. you need to look at tracking it in some way, shape, or form. Ideally you would put some workflow tools, and we and a number of others will develop tools around that can help. But you'll have your own in-house solutions, and then you need to manage it. And managing it comes to the policies, the processes, who's allowed work from that foreign jurisdiction, when do they need to be back into the country. So one of the key things, for example, we've seen a lot of stories where people are almost accepting the issue for 2020 and expecting people back, either already back in the country or back by 31 December 2020. The question is do you have a system, a process in order to track that they do indeed come back? So I think just then the final slide I have is in terms of the cross-functional piece. Obviously, there's a huge amount of issues, and tax falls into a number of the items. And I think from what Nuala and Catherine have already talked about, and into what Orla is speaking about, this really encapsulates the fact that no one person will solve this international remote working issue, and in fact you need significant engagement with the organisation in order to do so.
Darren, one quick question before we move on to Orla. From Alan, provision of equipment. My understanding is staff need to be charged BIK for desks and chairs. Is that correct?
It's really one of those that the Irish government haven't really been clear, and I'm assuming this is in an Irish context, Dorothy.
Yeah.
But so I assume typically what you've seen, and I did find it amusing that as we talk about remote working and developing, the big announcement in the budget was around broadband, and which meant very little to people in terms of deductibility. What would be more relevant is what do we do with our desks and chairs? Typically, we've seen that where the company retains the ownership of those desks and chairs, that there shouldn't be a BIK charge that applies. However, that is a little impractical, because clearly if all of your workforce has moved home and you've given everyone a desk and chair, there's no real chance you're ever going to take them back. You may get to a grey area where you might say, well, actually, we're going to have those individuals working from home for the foreseeable future after COVID ends. So that desk and chair will be used and does remain within the ownership of the organisation. And I think at that point you can get comfortable around the BIK. But I think if you do give them the desk and the chair, not that anyone really wants the desk and the chair in their house, but if you do give it to them, then a BIK charge could potentially apply.
And sorry, one other quick question from Wayne. Is it only Irish employees whose wages qualify for the R&D tax credit? Does it apply to staff who have relocated to another EU country?
So this is, I think, that was part of the point that I mentioned, and it really depends on the circumstances. So obviously, if you were typically working in Ireland, the main crux of the R&D tax credit is that the expenditure is incurred in Ireland typically, but in the EEA. The issue is that there are various restrictions around if that expense is deductible for corporate tax in another jurisdiction, then that potentially is restricted. So if in a scenario they're now working in Germany, in the EU, potentially that is still qualifying, but that hinges on not having a permanent establishment in that location. If the individual is working in India, for example, which is not in the EEA, then that expense will not qualify for the R&D tax credit.
Great. There's a couple of more questions from Eva, but we'll come back to it in the panel because I'm conscious of time. So I know you're going to hand over to Orla. Thanks, Darryl.
Perfect. Yes, I think I'm going to hand over to Orla, who's going to take us on a well-being and engagement journey.
Hi, how are you? If you just move on to the first slide, that'd be great, Niamh. Great. You can actually move on to the next one as well. So thank you, Darryl, Catherine, and Nuala for all your great insights so far. I've learned loads. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Orla Stafford, and actually I've recently just joined Deloitte as a senior manager in the human capital practice. And I've had the very interesting experience of joining the company virtually, and I still haven't met majority of my team, and I haven't actually been into the office. So it definitely has been a little bit challenging. Deloitte have done an incredible job virtually onboarding me and making me feel part of the team, but there is no doubt that I do miss that human connection. I definitely find working remotely extremely efficient, and you save time commuting, and everything is run really smoothly so far. But the question is, in general, to what expense does this lack of human connection have on the individual? How do people stay motivated? How do they continue to work in a remote environment when we're all seeing worrying levels of anxiety and burnout employees? So I'm delighted to take the next 10 minutes or so talking about how remote working is impacting employee engagement and well-being, and what companies need to consider in this space. Niamh, can you move on as well, please? I think there's some background noise as well, if someone can take off themselves on mute. Great. So yeah, look, it's hard to believe that it was only 10 months ago when we first heard about the coronavirus, and you're all used to seeing loads of these headlines that are on this slide. So the amount of change that's happened in companies over the last year is unprecedented. The number of people now working from home has trebled due to the pandemic, from 200,000 at the start of the year to over 700,000 now. So there's no doubt that companies and individuals have all really stepped up, and they've adapted, they've been creative and innovative in their thinking and completely changed the way they work. And I think the mindset, however, was this was, I suppose, a temporary solution. And I think we realize now that we're not going back to the way it was before. And the way we are working now has changed forever. And more than likely, we're going to have this hybrid model, which you've all talked about in the survey. So companies and individuals now need to embrace the changes and really lean into the many benefits of remote working, but also be proactive in dealing with the challenges we have about keeping employees motivated, engaged, and healthy. So Kathleen, I was going to speak a little bit about the new strategy, but Catherine's already spoken about, but really it was really about Leo Varadkar pledging to bring in proposals on the right to disconnect, to avoid this always on culture where people or workers are expected to respond to calls and emails outside of working hours. And the government is also considering establishing a right for employees to actually request to work remotely. So this is a consideration for the employers as well. So I think we just need to watch this space as the legislation is going to change. It's obviously good news for employees as the government will have their back, but also there will be implications for employers, and yeah, we all need to be prepared. Do you want to move on to the next slide, Niamh, please? Great. I just want to take a few minutes to talk about how we need to think about engaging our staff in this new environment. So people are an organization's most valuable asset. At the end of the day, what companies do now to help them through this time to make their employees have as positive as experience as possible will be a key differentiator into how companies attract and retain our staff going forward. Employees want to work and stay with companies that are going to look after them and also give them options. You know, focusing on the employee experience is so important to engagement. It's about focusing on tracking how employees think and feel during every single touch point of their journey through the company, right from recruitment right through to their exit. Deloitte have done a lot of market research and developed this model of employee experience called the Simply Irresistible model, and we've used it with lots of our clients to help identify ways to engage with employees at every step of their journey. And the model has 5 principles, you can see them on the slide, and that show what drives engagement, and 20 specific activities. The model is still relevant, however, we now need to look at it, all the activities with the additional overlay of well-being, remote working, and virtual collaboration, and really look at what employees need to do in each of these areas, taking these new lenses into consideration. So I'm not going to go through this model in detail. Dorothy, this will go up in the CCMA website if you want to read more, or any of them more documents I'll put there as well. There are 5 key areas though that companies need to focus on to create a workplace that lets people thrive. They are ensuring people are involved in meaningful work, they have supportive management, they're given growth opportunities, inclusive and flexible fun environment, and it's also about having leadership that they can trust. So just to pick out a couple of examples of looking at this model from a remote lens. So giving people autonomy is about letting people feel free to develop their own unique work style and bring creativity to the role. So recent Deloitte research has shown that during the pandemic, many employees have experienced a radical shift to a more independent way of working. So as organizations head towards recovery, they need therefore to think about how to leverage this increased autonomy and adapt their leadership style in order to guide workers' contributions but without micromanaging. So looking at supportive management, a weak manager is the reason why lots of people, as we know, leave companies. So companies need to really invest in managers to ensure they're equipped with these leadership skills required in this new environment, such as things like leading through ambiguity, having resilience, empathy, and actually having really, really strong listening skills. It's also important to have an agile performance management process with frequent, meaningful check-ins. So not just your yearly meeting. Performance can no longer be managed around presence and hours worked. It must be adapted to this increased autonomy of employees and being more outcome focused. And having a positive environment is all about developing a flexible, fair and inclusive work environment. So it's about seeing people as whole persons with lives and families and interests outside of work, and making sure you take that into consideration when you're adapting to your employees' needs. So being even more in tune with staff needs and their differences, and make sure that they feel heard and they feel recognised. So really, in summary, it's about keeping your employees engaged. It's not just about quick fixes or ad hoc initiatives. It's worth taking a holistic view of your entire employee experience, taking into consideration the impacts of remote working and well-being to allow you to cater to employees' needs and keep those people motivated and engaged. So you just move on there, Niamh? I'm conscious of the time. I'll try and get through this as quick as I can. I'm just going to talk a little bit about wellness. Deloitte first wrote about the overwhelmed wellness in 2014, so this issue of highly stressed employees is not new. However, I suppose the sudden move to remote working has brought about further challenges from a mental health perspective, including feelings of isolation and loneliness through lack of face-to-face collaboration, as well as unclear boundaries between work and personal time. We all recognise that the overuse of digital devices is linked to stress, burnout, sleeplessness and strained relationships. You can see in this slide, this is a summary of the wellness results from the Deloitte 2020 Human Capital Trends report. And the potentials are high and show that a large number of the respondents recognise well-being drives organisational performance and sees it as being important for the success. But actually, only 12% of people actually said that they were ready to do something about it. So you can see many organisations invested lots of money in well-being, but in order to make it really meaningful, it needs to be thought about from the employee's perspective and designed into the workforce itself in order to get individuals to perform at their best. So just the next slide, and you'll be happy to know this is my final slide. We've got 5 minutes. I'll try and do it as quick as I can. I mightn't go through all of it. I was asked to provide some tips and thoughts for both employers and employees in this whole topic of well-being. I'm actually also an executive coach as well as a consultant. And to be honest with you, stress and anxiety in this whole virtual world is a constant topic that I'm dealing with my clients and I see them struggling with. To be honest with you, this isn't rocket science. We all know what we need to do to look after ourselves. But unfortunately for many of us, the pressures of work get in the way and we tend to put ourselves at the bottom of that list. And our mental and physical health can really suffer. And this is even something I have to work hard at myself. So maybe even if you just take one thing away with you today or one small change based on what I say, that's a good result for me. So starting just really quickly with the employers, some of the things they need to consider. Firstly, if they haven't already done so, they need to really develop a remote and a hybrid working strategy and also well-being strategy, and look at designing this well-being and engagement into the flow of work and make sure they get the right level of ownership and commitment from leadership. It's really about listening to employees and respond to feedback quickly and take action and build on any of the lessons that you learned. We need to look at the different ways of collecting the feedback using organizational and HR data or whatever surveys or listening forums you can set up to really understand what people are saying. I mean, some companies have set up well-being check-ins for people to come to talk about how they're coping and what they might need. So the main thing really is just to get employees involved and to get them to give you the ideas. The next thing would also be about giving employees flexibility, giving people options around how they want to work. And people like to work in a way that makes them feel best and make sense with what's going on in their lives. It's important that leadership are transparent and there's a culture of trust and openness. Leaders need to demonstrate compassion and empathy, and they need to give your permission to be okay, and let people feel safe to open up and not feel judged if they're struggling. And also inspire their team to tell their own personal stories, how they're finding it in the working environment, share their challenges, how they're struggling, how they're coping. And it's about role modeling and encouraging a positive work-life balance. I mean, there's no point in a leader saying they encourage work-life balance and then they send an email at midnight. They need to walk the talk. And lastly, it's really about communication, no such thing as over communication. And really it's about making sure all the wellness options that you have and all the tools, whether it's yoga or stress management training or drop-in clinics, whatever you have, that people know about it and encourage them to use them. And the individual's perspective, I see I've only got 2 minutes. What do you want me to do, Valerie? I mean, I can put that in the notes after, or do you want me to continue? Or Dorothy?
I'm conscious of time. Yeah, if you don't mind, if you just want to come on to your last slide, Orla, and just to say to everybody.
Yeah, this is my last slide. I mean, really, it was really just tips about the individual, and I mean, I'm not going to go through them all. You can read them there yourself. I mean, the one thing is about having well-being as one of your own objectives, and really just being aware of the signs to look out for your own team members. But yeah, I don't want to. There's no point in me going into because we're conscious of running out of time. Thank you so much, Dorothy. I'll just pass back.
And sorry, Orla, I know that was very rushed for you there at the end. I apologize. I know the panelists are going to come back on. We won't have time for questions, but what I'll say to everybody is any of the questions that have come through that I haven't had to put, we will come back to you on. I'll go back to each of the panelists afterwards and they can come back to you, because I know there's some specific ones around health and safety, in particular, Nuala, that you might be able to go back to people. But also to say there are all the contact details for all of the speakers, and they're more than happy for people to connect to them directly, and the email address is there, or as always, you'll find people on LinkedIn, or if you want, just drop me an email and I'll put you in touch. And before we close out, I just really want to thank IDA and Greta, who I know is on the call, and some of our colleagues for their support. Obviously, thank our 4 panelists who have given up their time freely this afternoon, and we really appreciate it. And we know this is a very detailed topic in parts that people really are looking for further information on. So again, for anybody that's on the call, if there's any particular areas that you feel we didn't address that you would like to find a little bit more about, we just drop me an email and we'd be happy to come back, and we'd be probably looking to set up further webinars to delve in a little bit deeper. And Karen has asked, is there a copy of the slides, and it will be available, and anybody just get in touch with me, Dorothy at ccma.ie, but the recording and slides will also be on the CCMA website on the events page, and they're free to everybody. So we got there in an hour. Well done. We covered all of the topics. So thank you so much, everybody. And great to see such interest and such interaction. So really appreciate all of the audience. And Antoinette has finished off with saying, great webinar. Thanks to everyone involved. So thank you to all of the speakers. And as always, thanks to Niamh from WSI for her support and looking after all the techie things in the background. So thanks, everybody. And we'll see you all again soon.